It wasn't the first time I'd walked that route. I had taken it dozens of times, maybe hundreds, and yet, that afternoon, something felt different. The sun had dipped low in the sky, casting everything in a soft golden glow, the air warm but tinged with the coolness of the approaching evening. It was the perfect time for a walk, the kind of late afternoon when the world feels like it's holding its breath, suspended between day and night. I had just finished my work for the day and decided to take my usual path home. It was a quiet, familiar route, a street lined with trees, old houses with ivy creeping up the sides, the occasional cafe spilling its warmth onto the sidewalk. The route had become second nature to me. I didn't have to think about it. I could walk it in my sleep. But today was different. I stepped onto the path, my sneakers crunching against the gravel as I made my way down the familiar stretch. The first few steps felt normal, but then, as I passed a house I had always passed before, I realized something wasn't quite right. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just a feeling, a shift in the air that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I shook it off and kept walking, convincing myself that it was just my mind playing tricks, maybe the result of a stressful day. But the feeling didn't go away. It lingered like a shadow just out of sight. The trees above me, normally full of life and shade, seemed oddly still, their branches stiff and unmoving, despite the gentle breeze. I glanced at the street signs to reassure myself that I was still on track, still following the same route I always did. Everything checked out. Maple Street. Chestnut Avenue. All of it the same. I wasn't lost. I couldn't be. I rounded the corner, expecting to see the usual stretch of the road that led to my apartment complex. But when I turned, my stomach dropped. There was no apartment complex. Instead, the street ahead stretched into an unfamiliar cul-de-sac, the houses too new, too pristine to belong to the area I knew. The yards were manicured, the lawns impossibly green, and the homes were modern, sleek, almost sterile in their perfection. No rusted mailboxes. No cars with weathered paint sitting on the curb. Just houses with neatly trimmed hedges and no signs of life at all. I stopped in my tracks, confusion flooding my mind. I had walked this route countless times, yet I had never seen this cul-de-sac before. The street was wrong, the houses wrong. The architecture didn't fit with the neighborhood. It didn't fit with the place I knew. It was as if I had stepped into another version of the world, a parallel reality where my own path didn't exist. I turned around, trying to retrace my steps. My heart began to pound in my chest. The street behind me, the one I had just walked down, was gone. It was like the road had shifted, disappearing into thin air. The street signs I had passed moments ago, the houses, the very texture of the road itself, had changed. It wasn't the same street anymore. It was as if I had crossed some invisible boundary, and now, I was in a place that didn't belong to me. I stood frozen for a moment, trying to make sense of it all. I could still hear the distant hum of traffic, the faint sounds of the city beyond this strange, quiet neighborhood, but it felt farther away now, muted, as if the world had drawn back, leaving me in this liminal space between what I knew and what I didn't. I looked around, hoping to spot something, anything, that would help me understand where I was, or how I had gotten here. There was no sign, no indication that this place should exist in the way it did. The houses were too perfect. The air was too still. It was too empty. I turned again, looking down the unfamiliar cul-de-sac, the houses standing silent and vacant. A single car was parked in one of the driveways, but it looked too new, too pristine to be real. I couldn't place it. Everything in this new place felt wrong, out of sync with the rhythm of the world I knew. I started walking again, a desperate urge to find something familiar, something that would reassure me that I hadn't lost my mind. I walked down the cul-de-sac, each step heavy, the ground beneath my feet feeling foreign. The houses on either side seemed to loom over me, their perfect facades silent and uninviting. No lights in the windows. No people. just pristine, sterile silence. At the end of the street, I saw a small park, a patch of green surrounded by trees. I had to believe that if I could just make it to that park, I could find my bearings again. I could get out of this strange place and return to the world I knew. I quickened my pace, the park coming into view as I rounded the corner. But as I approached, my stomach twisted in fear. The park wasn't the same park I knew. The swing set was different, newer, shinier. The benches were made of smooth, unblemished metal, not the weathered wood I had always sat on. And the trees, those tall, towering oaks that had always stood guard over the park, were gone. In their place were smaller, perfectly shaped trees, their leaves a strange, unnatural green. I stopped in my tracks, staring at the park, a sense of dread creeping up my spine. This wasn't the park I knew. This wasn't my neighborhood. I looked around, searching for something, anything, that would explain what had happened. But there was nothing. Just empty streets, empty houses, and the growing sense that I had wandered into a place that didn't belong to me. A place that wasn't real. My heart raced, panic bubbling up inside me. I took one last look down the street, hoping to see something, anything, that would lead me back to the world I knew. But there was nothing. Just more of the same unfamiliar streets, the same pristine houses, the same dead silence. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't make sense of it. I had walked the same route, the one I knew so well, and yet it had led me to a place I didn't recognize, a place that didn't make sense. And now, I had no idea how to find my way back. I stood there, frozen in the middle of the park, trying to grasp what had just happened, but the silence pressed down on me, heavy and oppressive. I didn't know how long I stood there. I didn't know how long it would take before I found my way out. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this place, this strange, unfamiliar place, wasn't going to let me leave. And that thought, more than anything, terrified me. It was a quiet Saturday afternoon when I decided to take a walk. I wasn't in any particular hurry. I didn't need anything, not really, except maybe a bit of fresh air and the comforting rhythm of walking. I had been living in the city for a few months, and there was a small cafe I liked to visit near the edge of town. I had walked there many times before, so I figured I'd go again, as if it were a ritual that needed repeating, something familiar. But that day, something felt different. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, just a subtle shift in the air, something that made my skin prickle in a way that I tried to ignore. I set off, walking down the same road I had walked 100 times, past the same gray buildings and faded signs. It wasn't the first time I had noticed how quiet the streets were, but today it seemed quieter, like the world was holding its breath. I passed the small corner shop that always seemed to have the same dusty window displays, the bakery with the smell of fresh bread wafting out, and the park where the kids were usually playing. It was all routine. But I wasn't paying much attention anymore. My mind was elsewhere, caught up in thoughts of work, of life, of everything that felt just a little out of reach. It wasn't until I reached the intersection by the old bookstore that I noticed her. She was standing on the corner, an older woman, dressed in a faded blue coat, her scarf wrapped tightly around her neck. She had a kind face, one that seemed as though she had seen 1,000 days like this one. Her eyes, though, were sharp, intense in a way that made me pause. She was looking at me now, and for a moment, I wondered if she had been watching me for some time. I stopped walking, unsure of what to do. She smiled, the sort of smile that made you feel like she knew something you didn't. "Excuse me," she said, her voice soft but clear. "You're headed to the cafe, aren't you?" I nodded, taken aback by her accuracy. "Yes, actually." "How did you know?" She smiled again, but this time, it seemed knowing, as if she was privy to some unspoken connection between us. "I've seen you walking down this road before. You usually go there, don't you? You'll find it's a little farther down today, but don't worry. I'll give you directions." I felt a strange flutter of curiosity. "Thank you, but I've been there plenty of times. I know the way." Her eyes sparkled with something unspoken, but she didn't argue. "You'll see," she said, pulling a piece of paper from her coat pocket. "Take this with you. It'll help." I took the folded piece of paper from her, thinking it was just a harmless gesture. She gave me a soft nod, then turned and walked away without another word, disappearing into the street behind me. I unfolded the paper and looked down at the scribbled directions. The handwriting was neat, almost perfect, but there was something about it that made me feel uneasy. I couldn't explain it. The directions seemed wrong, in a subtle way. They weren't the route I was used to taking. She had written something like, "Walk down this street, take the third left, and continue straight until you reach the end. The cafe will be on your left." I shook my head. It didn't make sense. I had always taken the second left before reaching the end of the street. This was different. And yet, the more I looked at the paper, the more confident I felt that I should follow these new directions. Something about them felt right, even though they seemed completely off. So, I began walking again, this time following the path she had written. The street seemed quieter than before, more muted somehow. The usual noise of the city felt distant, as if the world had shrunk down just for me. I turned the first corner, then the second, then, just as she had written, I took the third left. And that's when it happened. I looked down at the paper again, and the directions had changed. The writing was still there, but the words had shifted, subtly, like a ripple in a pond. The third left was no longer the third left, it was now the fourth. The path had been altered, just enough to make me second-guess myself. Confused, I glanced around. The street looked the same, nothing had changed, yet somehow everything felt different. I could see the cafe in the distance, just a block away, but according to the new directions, I was supposed to turn again, to keep walking farther down the street. The voice in my head told me to trust my instincts, to ignore the paper and just go. I had walked this way countless times. But for some reason, I felt compelled to follow the directions. It was as if the act of questioning them had pulled me deeper into something I couldn't control. I hesitated for a moment, staring at the paper. The directions had changed again. Now, instead of turning right, it said, "Continue straight. The cafe will be on your right." I looked up, confused, but I didn't see the familiar sign of the cafe ahead of me. There was nothing but more street, a few empty shops, and a faint smell of something that I couldn't quite place. It wasn't the smell of fresh coffee or the warm bread I had expected. I kept walking. The more I looked at the paper, the more it shifted, as if the directions themselves were alive, evolving, mutating into something new every time I glanced at them. I felt dizzy. I looked down at the paper again, but this time, it was blank. No more directions. Just empty white space. Panic set in. The street in front of me looked unfamiliar, though it should have been the one I had walked down countless times. There were new buildings, new signs, things that didn't belong. The cafe should have been right there, just a few steps away, but it wasn't. I walked faster, my heart pounding, feeling the familiar streets around me warp into something unrecognizable. The paper was gone now, disintegrated in my hand, leaving nothing but the lingering feeling of its presence. And still, the cafe was nowhere to be found. I walked, and I walked, following the shifting directions, only to realize I had walked in circles. Every street led me back to where I had started. The woman's face flashed in my mind, her knowing smile. Was this her doing? Had I somehow stepped into a place that didn't follow the rules of time and space? The last time I checked, I was no longer sure if I had ever truly left my neighborhood. Was I still on the same street, or was this an entirely different world now? No matter how many steps I took, I couldn't shake the feeling that the directions had never been real to begin with. They had always been changing, as if the path to where I was supposed to go didn't exist at all. I stood still, breathing heavily, as the world around me blurred and twisted. The directions had changed again. I could feel it. I just couldn't figure out where I was anymore. And that was when I realized, the more I looked, the more I followed, the more the directions would change. There would never be an end. It was a rare kind of silence, the sort that seemed almost unnatural. I had lived in the city for years, and I had grown used to its noises, the hum of traffic, the chatter of people on the sidewalks, the constant rush of life that seemed to never stop. But that day, there was nothing. No cars speeding by, no distant voices drifting through the air. The usual bustle of city life had vanished, replaced by a kind of stillness that felt too heavy, too oppressive. I stepped outside, the cool air greeting me as I closed the door behind me. The streets were empty, almost as if the city itself had paused, holding its breath. The sky above was overcast, a thick blanket of clouds that seemed to deepen the quiet around me. It wasn't the first time I had noticed the city being quieter than usual, but today, it felt different. It felt wrong. I walked down the street, my footsteps echoing louder than they should have on the pavement. The buildings on either side stood like silent sentinels, their windows dark, as if no one had lived in them for years. The familiar landmarks, the small cafe on the corner, the park I always passed by, were there, but they felt distant, like they belonged to another time. A time before the silence. As I made my way down the street, I felt a chill run down my spine, a sensation I couldn't shake. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone, anyone, walking past, but there was no one. The streets were as empty as the silence that hung in the air. But then, I heard it. A soft whisper, just on the edge of my hearing. So faint I almost thought I had imagined it. I stopped in my tracks, straining my ears. The whisper came again, this time a little clearer, but still distant, as though it was coming from somewhere just out of reach. I turned, looking around, but the street was still empty. No one in sight. The buildings stood unmoving, their windows like dark eyes staring at me. I shook my head, trying to dismiss it as my mind playing tricks. I had been working a lot lately, maybe I was just tired. Maybe the quiet had gotten to me. I kept walking, but the whispers followed. It was as if they were just behind me, slipping between the spaces of my thoughts, curling around the edges of my consciousness. I quickened my pace, the sound of my footsteps blending with the whispers that seemed to multiply, growing louder, more distinct with every step I took. It was as though the city itself was whispering, each building, each street corner, all of them carrying some quiet secret that I wasn't meant to hear. The sound wasn't just in my ears, it was in my mind, a murmur that wrapped itself around my thoughts, as if trying to pull me into something I couldn't understand. I turned a corner, hoping to escape whatever it was that was following me, but the whispers didn't stop. They were louder now, as if they were just behind the next turn, around the next block. I looked around, but the streets were still deserted, the city still eerily quiet. There was no one. But the whispers, they were there, unmistakable, like voices carried by the wind, telling stories I couldn't make sense of. The whispers weren't just a sound. They were a feeling. A pressure on my chest, an itch at the back of my mind. I could feel them in my bones, in my skin. The words were fragmented, half-formed, as if they were meant for someone else, but somehow they were reaching me. I couldn't make out the words, but I could feel the urgency in them, the strange pull they had on me. I stopped again, my breath shallow, my heart racing. I wanted to run, to get away from the whispers, but something in me held me back. It was as if the whispers were a thread, pulling me forward, forcing me to listen, to understand. I didn't know what it was, but it felt like I was being drawn toward something, something just out of sight, something waiting for me. I glanced up at the buildings again, hoping to find something that made sense, but all I saw were the dark windows, staring down at me like silent watchers. I turned around, half expecting to see someone there, someone who could explain what was happening, but the street was still empty, still silent, except for the whispers that continued to fill the air. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to leave, to get out of the city and find some peace. But as I turned to head back the way I came, the whispers grew louder, sharper, as though they were now right beside me, breathing in my ear. I covered my ears, trying to block them out, but it was no use. They were inside me now, swirling through my thoughts, wrapping around my mind like a dark cloud. I broke into a run, my footsteps echoing loudly, drowning out the whispers for a moment. But even as I ran, I could feel them closing in on me. They weren't just in my head anymore. They were everywhere. The city had become a labyrinth of voices, all speaking at once, too quiet to understand, but too close to ignore. I rounded another corner, hoping to find some escape, but instead, I found myself back where I had started, at the same intersection, the same street, the same empty sidewalk. It was as if I had never left. The buildings stood unchanged, the silence still hung heavy in the air. The whispers were gone, but the pressure remained, the feeling that I was still being watched, still being pulled into something I couldn't escape. I stood there, confused and out of breath, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had I been walking in circles? Had the city changed while I wasn't looking? I didn't know. All I knew was that the city, the quiet streets, the empty buildings, everything had shifted. It wasn't just silent anymore. It was watching me. I took a step forward, my feet dragging. The whispers might have stopped, but the feeling hadn't gone away. I could still hear them in my mind, faint and distant but always there, waiting for me to listen, waiting for me to understand. And I knew, deep down, that the silence of the city had never truly been quiet. It had always been filled with whispers, hidden just behind every corner. And they would never stop. It was supposed to be a simple thing, just a door, leading to a room I had never been in before. I had seen it 100 times, tucked away at the end of the hallway, behind a faded wooden frame that had always seemed slightly out of place. The door wasn't anything special, not particularly grand or ornate, just an old wooden door that looked as though it had been there longer than the house itself. But for some reason, that afternoon, I felt an almost irresistible urge to open it. Maybe it was the strange quiet that filled the house that day or the peculiar stillness that had settled over everything. I had been pacing up and down the hallway for what felt like hours, searching for something, or perhaps just avoiding the emptiness that had begun to settle in my chest. I had lived in this house for years, but something about that door always bothered me. I would pass it by without a second glance, too busy with my routine to think twice. But today was different. The air felt heavier, thicker, and when I stopped in front of that door, I felt something shift. It was as though the house was waiting for me to take that step. I reached out, my hand trembling as I gripped the cool brass doorknob. The door creaked slightly as I turned it, but it opened easily, almost as if it had been expecting me. Beyond the door was a small room, lit by a faint, warm glow, casting long shadows on the walls. It was unlike any room in the house. The space was modest, a simple sitting room, but it felt unfamiliar, like a place I shouldn't have been. The furniture was old, but not in the way the rest of the house was. This room had a different energy, something off-kilter. The curtains were drawn, the air thick with dust. I stepped in, my heart racing in my chest, unsure of what had drawn me here, but feeling inexplicably compelled to continue. The room itself was empty, except for a small armchair positioned near the window, facing away from me. I noticed the walls were lined with old photographs, their edges yellowed with age. The images were too distant for me to make out, but there was something haunting in the way they seemed to stare at me, as if frozen in time. I stepped further inside, my footfalls muffled on the thick carpet. There was a faint smell in the air, something nostalgic, but not pleasant, a mix of mildew and old wood. I paused, glancing around, and that's when I realized something strange. I couldn't remember how I had gotten here. It wasn't just that the room felt unfamiliar, it felt wrong, as though I had stepped into a place that had been waiting for me, not the other way around. I turned to leave, but as I reached for the door, it was gone. The doorframe, the exit I had just come through, it was no longer there. Just the bare wall, smooth and featureless, where the door had been moments ago. My breath caught in my throat, panic rising as I scrambled back, searching for the handle that had been there just a moment before. There was nothing. No door. Just an empty wall. I ran my hands across the surface, the cool plaster against my fingertips, feeling the smoothness, the unsettling silence of the room. I spun around, hoping to find some other way out, but all I could see was the same furniture, the same empty photographs, the same chair facing away from me. The room seemed to close in on me, the air growing thick and suffocating. Suddenly, the chair shifted. A creak. It turned slowly, impossibly, as though it had been waiting for me to notice. I froze, my heart pounding. And then, I saw it. The figure sitting in the chair. It was a woman, her back to me, her hands resting on the arms of the chair. She wore a long, dark dress, her hair spilling over her shoulders in loose waves. For a moment, I thought she was just a trick of the light, or perhaps my mind playing games with me. But then she moved. Her head turned slowly, deliberately, until she was facing me. Her face was pale, her eyes dark and hollow, as though she had been sitting there for an eternity. There was something eerie in her stillness, in the way she regarded me, as if she had been expecting me all along. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her gaze was enough to send a chill down my spine. I wanted to leave. I needed to leave. I spun around, my hand reaching out to where the door had been, but there was nothing. No door. No way out. My breath came in shallow gasps, the room feeling smaller, more confining with every passing second. I pressed myself against the wall, desperate for a way out, but there was nothing. Only the woman in the chair, watching me silently, as if she were waiting for something. And then, just as suddenly as it had all begun, I woke up. I was back in the hallway. My feet were planted firmly on the wooden floor, the faint scent of dust still in the air. The door was still there, standing before me, unchanged. I reached out to touch it again, but this time, I hesitated. I felt dizzy, like I had just woken from a strange, unsettling dream. My hand hovered over the doorknob for a moment, and I thought I heard the faintest creak of the door swinging open, as if inviting me back in. But something stopped me. I pulled my hand back, stepping away from the door, my mind racing. I didn't know what had happened, whether it was real or just my imagination. Maybe it was some strange trick of the house, a shift in the air, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been somewhere else, somewhere I wasn't supposed to be. I turned around and walked down the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The house was quiet again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different now. I felt as though I had been marked, as though I had crossed some invisible boundary that would never be undone. And when I glanced back down the hallway, I saw the door once more. It stood at the end, just as it always had, but now, it seemed to beckon, whispering something to me that I couldn't quite hear. I didn't go back. But I knew that the next time I did, it wouldn't be the same. The door would be waiting, and I would end up back in that room again, with no way out. It was a quiet evening, one of those early spring nights when the air is crisp, but the warmth of the day still lingers. I had just returned home from work, my footsteps echoing in the empty street as I approached my building. I lived on the ground floor, a small apartment with a little garden out front, hidden from the main road by a thick hedge. It was peaceful, if not a little isolated. The building itself was old, probably from the early 1900s, with faded brickwork and windows that seemed to sag with time. Still, it had character, a certain charm that I had come to appreciate. I wasn't expecting anything unusual that night, just the usual routine of coming home, fixing a simple dinner, and winding down. But when I reached the entrance, something caught my eye. A figure stood on the balcony of the apartment above mine, the light from the street lamp casting a soft glow around her silhouette. She was smiling, but it wasn't just any smile. It was a wide, knowing smile, one that seemed to carry an odd sense of familiarity. She wasn't doing anything else, just standing there, watching me with an intensity that I couldn't quite explain. For a moment, I paused, unsure of what to do. I glanced around, wondering if she was just someone who lived in the building, but I hadn't seen her before. I knew my neighbors well enough, the building was small, and I had spoken to most of them at one point or another. But this woman wasn't someone I recognized. I stood there, staring up at her, and though she didn't move, there was something oddly magnetic about her presence. The smile never wavered, and it seemed to grow just a little bit more unsettling with every passing second. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. It wasn't just the smile, it was the stillness of the moment, the way she stood there as though frozen in time, her eyes never leaving mine. I half-heartedly waved, a polite but unsure gesture, not sure if I should speak or just ignore it and move on. But as I did, her smile widened, and she gave me a slow, deliberate nod, as if acknowledging something between us that I couldn't quite grasp. I took a step forward, my curiosity outweighing the discomfort creeping along my spine. "Hello?" I called out, unsure why I felt the need to speak at all. But there was no response. She didn't say anything, just stood there, still and silent, her smile unwavering. I felt a shiver run down my spine, the hairs on my neck standing on end. Something wasn't right. I pulled my keys out of my pocket, my fingers fumbling nervously with them as I tried to unlock the door to my apartment. But every time I glanced back up at the balcony, the woman was still there, watching, smiling. Her eyes seemed to follow my every movement, even when I wasn't looking directly at her. It was as if she knew what I was thinking before I did. I finally managed to unlock the door and step inside, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. I closed the door behind me, the lock clicking shut, but something inside me told me that it wouldn't make any difference. It wasn't the door I needed to worry about. It was her. I tried to brush off the sensation, telling myself that it was just a random encounter, just someone who happened to live above me. But as I moved around the apartment, I kept glancing up toward the window, half expecting to see her face peering down at me. But the window was empty, the curtains drawn, just like always. I set about making dinner, trying to lose myself in the familiar routine of chopping vegetables and stirring pots, but my thoughts kept drifting back to her. That smile. That strange, unblinking smile. I didn't know how much time passed before I heard the knock at the door. It was soft at first, hesitant, but persistent. I stood frozen for a moment, the knife still in my hand, before I cautiously approached the door. The apartment was quiet again, the stillness pressing down on me like a weight. I peeked through the peephole. There was no one there. I opened the door slightly, just enough to see the hallway, but it was empty. No one. No sign of anyone at all. I stepped back, my mind racing. Had I imagined it? The knocking? Or had I somehow missed someone standing there, just out of sight? I closed the door, my heart pounding in my chest, and once again, I glanced up toward the balcony. She was there. Her face, pale and ghostly in the dim light, was staring down at me. But this time, there was something different. She wasn't smiling anymore. Instead, her expression was blank, emotionless, as if the smile had been an illusion. I felt a chill wash over me, and for the first time, I truly felt the weight of her gaze, like she was looking into me, seeing something I couldn't hide. I stepped back from the window, my heart racing in my chest, my breath shallow. It was then that I realized the truth. She was still on the balcony, smiling, but I was on the ground floor. How could she possibly be looking at me from there? There was no balcony above mine. No apartment. The building had always been 2 stories, my apartment on the ground floor, and the one above it. But the balcony had been there. I had seen it. I had seen her standing there. And she had smiled at me, a smile that now felt like a warning, a challenge, something darker than I had ever realized. I hurried over to the window, my hands shaking as I pulled the curtains back. But the balcony was gone. The space where it had been, the place where she had stood just moments before, was completely empty. Nothing. No balcony. Just a blank wall where it should have been. I stumbled back from the window, my mind reeling. My apartment felt smaller now, suffocating, as if the walls were closing in. I tried to tell myself that I had imagined the whole thing, that I had just been too tired, too caught up in my own thoughts. But deep down, I knew that what I had seen wasn't just my mind playing tricks on me. She had smiled at me, but she wasn't really there. She had never been there. And yet, somehow, she still was. It was late, too late, really. The city was quiet, as it often is at this hour, when the hum of life seems to slip away and leave behind only the soft whispers of the wind and the occasional rustle of trees. The streetlights flickered, casting long, jagged shadows that stretched across the pavement like ghostly fingers reaching for something just out of reach. The quiet was almost oppressive, as if the world itself was holding its breath. I was walking home after a long day, the weight of it still heavy on my shoulders. It wasn't the sort of night where you'd expect anything unusual. Just the typical post-work routine. The walk through the empty streets, the silence of the city at this hour, the quiet murmur of the wind through the leaves. It was peaceful, in an unsettling way. But tonight, something felt different. As I walked, I couldn't help but notice how the streetlights were behaving. Normally, they would hum softly and stay lit, steady against the dark sky, but tonight they were flickering. Not in a natural, rhythmic way, like when a bulb is about to burn out, but in a strange, erratic pattern. Sometimes they would shine brightly for a few seconds, only to dim, then flicker wildly, as if the very light itself was struggling to stay alive. I wasn't sure what it was, maybe a problem with the wiring, something mundane, but the flickering felt too deliberate, too purposeful. I walked on, but the streetlights continued to flicker, and I found myself following them down the street, drawn to the uneven pulse of light as though it was guiding me. As I passed each light, the darkness between them felt deeper, more suffocating. I glanced around, but there was no one. The street was empty, save for the distant rustle of wind in the trees. The buildings loomed on either side, their windows dark and lifeless, as if the city had abandoned this street entirely. And then, just as I passed under the next flickering light, it went out completely. I stopped in my tracks, standing in the sudden darkness. The streetlight ahead of me was now a black void, the kind of darkness that seemed to swallow the very air around it. I stared at it for a moment, trying to make sense of it. My first thought was that it was some kind of malfunction, a temporary power outage or a faulty connection. But the longer I stood there, the more I realized that it didn't feel like an accident. It felt intentional. I hesitated, looking around. I couldn't see the light switch anywhere. I had never really thought about it before, but where was the switch that controlled these lights? I looked at the pole, the metal structure rising in the darkness, but there was no visible switch, no box or dial to indicate how to turn it off. I felt a strange urgency creep up my spine, the need to fix it, to somehow stop the flickering, stop the darkness from swallowing the light. I started walking again, my steps slower now, more cautious. The street ahead was dark, and the next light flickered just once before going out, too. Then the next. And the next. It was as if the darkness was spreading, the lights dying one by one in a pattern that seemed too deliberate to be a mere accident. I stopped again, looking behind me. The path I had just walked was now in total darkness. The only light left was far ahead, the last streetlight, and it was still flickering, but just barely, as though it, too, was struggling to stay alive. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine, but I couldn't bring myself to turn back. My legs moved forward on their own, pulled by some unseen force, my gaze locked on the faint glow of the remaining light. It was getting weaker with every step I took, the flickering growing more sporadic, more desperate. And then, just as I was nearly beneath it, the light flickered one last time before it, too, went out. I stood there in complete darkness. The silence was deafening now, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring, the kind of silence that feels wrong. My eyes strained, but I couldn't see a thing. It was as if the darkness had consumed everything around me. The pavement beneath my feet, the buildings on either side, the trees above, all gone, swallowed by the dark. I felt panic rising in my chest. How had this happened? How had everything gone so dark so quickly? I reached out, my hands trembling, feeling for the nearest wall or post, anything to anchor myself to something real. But there was nothing. Just the void. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to calm my racing heart, trying to convince myself that I could find my way out of this. When I opened my eyes again, I saw it. A faint glow, far in the distance, just beyond the edge of the darkness. It was soft at first, like a distant star, but it was enough to give me hope. I didn't know where it was coming from or what it was, but I started walking toward it, my feet stumbling in the dark, trying to keep my balance. The closer I got, the brighter the glow became. It wasn't the soft yellow of a streetlight, it was a cold, blue light, flickering like the others had, but more insistent, more demanding. I kept moving toward it, the light pulling me in, until I was standing beneath it, my eyes adjusting to the brightness. It wasn't a streetlight at all. It was a switch. A large, metallic switch, the kind you might find on an electrical panel, glowing with a faint, eerie light. It was the source of everything, the thing that had been flickering, causing the darkness to spread. My mind raced as I looked at it, not sure if I should touch it, not sure if I wanted to know what would happen. But I couldn't stop myself. My hand reached out, drawn to it, as if the switch itself had a hold on me. My fingers brushed against the cool metal, and for a moment, nothing happened. The light didn't change. The darkness didn't retreat. Everything stayed still, as if the world had frozen in that single, suspended moment. And then, with a slow, mechanical groan, the switch flipped. The world around me shifted. The streetlights flickered back to life, one by one, but this time, the light was different. Brighter. Almost blinding. I looked around, expecting to see the street return to its familiar form, the buildings and trees and sidewalk I had known so well. But it wasn't the same. The street was different. The buildings were different. And standing at the end of the street, bathed in the harsh light of the newly revived streetlights, was a figure. I couldn't see their face, but I could feel them staring at me. Watching me. The switch was still in my hand, and the street around me felt more empty than before, more foreign. I looked at the switch one more time, and then I realized something. There was no switch to turn it off. It was a small, unassuming store tucked in a quiet corner of the neighborhood, one I had passed countless times without giving it much thought. The kind of place that blends into the background, the windows obscured by faded curtains, the sign hanging loosely above the door, half obscured by peeling paint. I had always meant to stop in and take a look, but somehow, I never had. Until that night. I had been walking home from dinner when I noticed it again, the store, sitting there, as it always had, but something about it seemed different. It was the way the light from the street lamps caught on the glass, casting long, distorted shadows across the sidewalk. It was quiet, too quiet. The city had a usual hum to it at night, a buzz that never seemed to cease, but here, just in front of this store, everything felt still. The air was thick with something I couldn't place. I paused. I had a strange urge to go inside. It wasn't something I'd normally do, but for some reason, it felt important. Maybe I was just tired of the monotony, tired of always walking past it and never really knowing what was inside. Perhaps I was just looking for something new, something different. I reached for the handle of the door, and the moment I touched it, a wave of unease washed over me. It felt colder than it should have been, the metal cold against my fingertips. I hesitated, but then pushed the door open anyway. The bell above the door chimed faintly as I entered, its sound strangely hollow in the stillness. Inside, the store was dimly lit, just a few lamps casting warm pools of light on the old wooden shelves, stacked haphazardly with trinkets and dusty books. The air smelled faintly of old paper, like something long forgotten. The shelves seemed full of forgotten objects, knickknacks, old clocks, porcelain dolls with cracked faces. It was the kind of place where you would expect to find things that had no real value, things that had outlived their usefulness and were left to collect dust. I stepped further inside, but something felt wrong. I couldn't quite put my finger on it at first. It wasn't just the stillness of the place. It was as if the store was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I turned around, half expecting to see someone behind the counter, but the space was empty. No shopkeeper, no customers. Just me, standing alone in this dimly lit room. I called out, "Hello?" My voice sounded too loud in the silence, bouncing off the walls in an unnatural way. No answer. I shrugged, feeling silly. Maybe it was just a small, unattended shop, perhaps it was only open at certain hours, though it was strange that the door had been unlocked. But then I noticed something that stopped me cold. The door I had just walked through was now closed. I hadn't heard it close, hadn't seen anyone touch it, but it was shut tight behind me, the small brass handle turned as though someone had locked it from the inside. I stepped back toward it, my heart rate quickening. The handle turned easily enough, but when I tried to pull the door open, it wouldn't budge. It was as if something invisible was holding it shut. I pressed my shoulder against it, the old wood creaking in protest, but still, the door didn't move. I backed away, my mind spinning. Something wasn't right. The store was closed, I could tell. The lights were dim, the shelves empty of fresh stock, everything pointed to it being out of business, or at least closed for the night. But why had I been able to walk in? Why was the door open, and why had it closed behind me so suddenly? I turned back to the room, hoping to find some explanation, but the store had changed. The layout was subtly different. The shelves, which had once been filled with trinkets and old books, were now filled with strange, unfamiliar items. Objects that hadn't been there a moment before. A cracked mirror hung on the wall, its surface covered in grime, reflecting nothing but the empty shelves. A wooden chest sat in the corner, its lid slightly ajar, as though something had been hastily shoved inside. And in the far corner, an old rocking chair creaked slowly, as if someone had just gotten up from it. My breath caught in my throat. The air was thicker now, heavier, like it was pressing in on me from all sides. I felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of being trapped, as if the store itself had taken on a life of its own, closing in around me, pushing me deeper into its walls. The silence was suffocating, the only sound the slow, rhythmic creak of the rocking chair. I tried to focus on something, anything, but the more I looked around, the more things seemed to shift. A painting on the wall, one I could have sworn had been facing the other way, now stared at me with its vacant eyes. The light seemed to dim further, flickering in and out as though the power was unstable. I turned to the door again, desperation clawing at me. It had to open. I needed to leave. But as I approached it, I froze. A figure stood on the other side of the glass, its outline barely visible in the dim light. It was too distorted to make out any features clearly, but I could tell it was watching me. Waiting. I couldn't see its face, but I felt its eyes on me, piercing through the glass, holding me there. I stepped back instinctively, my heart racing. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its presence pressing against me, an invisible weight in the room. And then, as if on cue, the door clicked open. Slowly. Uneasily. I didn't hesitate. I didn't look back. I pushed through the door and stepped into the street, the cool night air hitting my skin like a breath of fresh air. The street outside was just as it had been when I first walked up, the quiet, empty street, the streetlights flickering faintly in the distance. I turned around, expecting to see the store behind me, but it wasn't there. In its place was a blank wall. The windows were gone. The door was gone. There was nothing but an empty space where the store had been. I stood there for a long moment, my mind trying to process what had just happened. The store, it had never been open. It had never been anything but a shadow in my memory. But for a brief moment, I had entered it. And now, it was gone. Just like it had never existed at all. It started on an ordinary morning, like any other. The kind of morning that felt familiar and calm, with the sun filtering through the windows and the quiet hum of the city just beginning to stir. I was walking down the street, taking my usual route to the cafe, when I noticed her for the first time. She was standing near the corner, just by the street sign. She was dressed in a simple, faded coat, her hair tied back loosely. She wasn't remarkable in any way, but there was something about her that caught my attention. Maybe it was the way she stood there, so still, as if waiting for something, or someone. I kept walking, my feet moving automatically along the sidewalk. But as I neared her, she suddenly turned and pointed up at the street sign. "Over there," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "It's right there." I paused, confused. The street sign was a few feet away, the usual one marking the corner of the street, just the normal, everyday signage. But something about the way she pointed, the way her eyes locked onto the sign, made me look at it more closely. I couldn't explain it, but something was off. The sign said something different than usual. The familiar lettering, what I had always known it to say, was now replaced by a string of words I didn't recognize. It was jumbled, cryptic, almost like a message I couldn't decode. The name of the street was unrecognizable. The colors were darker, the lettering warped, like it had been smudged or altered in some way. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and looked again. The sign was back to normal. The same street name I had passed 100 times. "What's wrong?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She smiled faintly, as though my confusion didn't surprise her. "You saw it, didn't you?" she asked, but I wasn't sure if she was speaking to me or to herself. Before I could respond, I turned my gaze back to the sign. It was different again. The letters were now scrambled, like the sign had been freshly painted and the paint hadn't dried. The words were almost readable but faded at the edges, as though they were bleeding into the wood, spreading out of place. I felt a shiver run down my spine. I glanced back at her, but she wasn't looking at me anymore. She was staring at the sign, her hand still pointing up at it, her eyes distant, almost vacant. "What is happening?" I murmured, more to myself than to her. She didn't answer, but I noticed her lips move as if she were repeating something under her breath. I tried to focus on her words, but they were too soft, too indistinct. They seemed to melt into the surrounding silence. I looked back at the sign, now even more perplexed. This time, the sign was entirely blank. The metal frame still stood, but the surface where the street name should have been was an empty void. The absence of any text was more unsettling than if it had been filled with nonsense words. It was as if someone had deliberately erased it. It felt like something important had been removed, something that I should have understood but couldn't. I took a step back, feeling the weight of something heavy in the air around me. The street felt different now. The normal sounds of the city, the distant murmur of cars, the chatter of people, seemed muffled, as if the world was suddenly too far away, out of reach. I turned back to the woman, but she was gone. Just like that. One moment she had been standing next to me, pointing to the sign, and now there was nothing. The street was empty, save for the few pedestrians passing by, oblivious to everything that had just happened. I took a few uncertain steps toward the sign again. I had to know if it had changed again, if what I was seeing was real. I had to understand. The street sign had returned to normal, just as it had been before. No distortion, no cryptic messages. It was simply the name of the street, clear and unremarkable. I stood there for a long time, staring at it, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had I imagined it? I looked around, expecting to see the woman reappear, but there was nothing. No one on the corner. No one near the sign. Just the empty street, the normal, quiet hum of life. I tried to shake the feeling of unease that had settled in my chest, but it lingered, gnawing at me. The street was the same as it always had been, yet everything had changed. I couldn't quite place what had happened, but the memory of her pointing at that sign, the way it had shifted, would not leave me. I walked a few more steps, trying to move on, but I couldn't. It felt as though something had slipped out of my grasp, something that I couldn't explain. As I walked, I looked back once more, half expecting to see her again. But this time, I saw something else. The street sign, this time, for sure, was different again. This time, it was the street I knew, the name I recognized. But now, the words seemed to blur at the edges, like they were being written in real time, forming and unforming with every blink. And I could swear I saw it changing, shifting in front of my eyes, faster than I could comprehend, faster than I could focus. I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts, but the sensation stayed with me. No matter how hard I tried to rationalize it, the street sign kept changing, slipping away just as I thought I understood it. It felt as though the world around me was bending, changing, and I was just barely keeping up. I didn't stop walking. I couldn't. And when I looked again, the street sign was gone entirely. The post was still there, standing tall, but there was no sign. Only the empty space where it had been, the vacant air that seemed to stretch on endlessly. And then, from somewhere deep in the distance, I heard her voice. Her soft, whispering words, just as faint as before, but this time, they were clearer. "You can't stay here forever." I turned, but she was gone. Only the empty street remained. It was a usual evening, the kind where the city's pulse felt steady, the hum of life buzzing around me. The subway station was crowded, but not unusually so. The walls echoed with the sounds of hurried footsteps, the soft chatter of commuters, the occasional scrape of shoes on the concrete floor. I was tired, worn out from the day, my mind drifting as I waited for the train to arrive. I had just finished a long shift at work, and the weight of the day's exhaustion settled heavily on my shoulders. The platform was familiar, the same tiles, the same fluorescent lights overhead that flickered slightly, giving the entire space a sterile, almost eerie feel. When the train finally pulled in, I didn't hesitate. I stepped forward, just like I always did, squeezing myself through the crowd of people. The doors slid open with their usual mechanical hum, and I found a spot near the door, leaning against the cold metal. The air inside the train was thick with the scent of tired people, the mixture of perfume, sweat, and the faint, musty smell of the old, metal carriage. As the train rumbled to life, I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the sway of the movement carry me into a sort of trance. The motion of the train always had this calming effect, like a lullaby, coaxing my thoughts into a more peaceful rhythm. I could feel the vibrations of the train's wheels on the tracks, a constant, familiar hum that had always comforted me, even on days when nothing felt quite right. But then, without any warning, the train stopped. The sudden halt jerked me forward slightly, and I grabbed the pole for support. At first, I thought it was just a temporary delay, maybe a signal problem, or a technical glitch. The train often stopped unexpectedly, sometimes for minutes at a time, but then it would always start moving again. So I waited, half lost in the rhythm of the train's stillness, the strange way the world outside the windows remained static while the city's pulse seemed to carry on without us. But as I waited, I realized something. I wasn't just standing still. I was still moving. It was subtle at first, almost unnoticeable, but the sensation of movement was there. My body, although stationary in the train, was drifting, gliding forward in the same direction the train had been moving. It was like being caught in the current of water, where you could feel the pull but not see it, not fully understand it. I felt a strange pull, a subtle pressure against my chest, like the train's momentum had somehow attached itself to me. I blinked, trying to steady myself, but the sensation only grew stronger. I looked around. People were still sitting in their seats, some scrolling through their phones, others gazing out the windows. No one seemed to notice anything odd. No one seemed to feel the subtle shift, the pull of movement in a place where nothing was moving. The quiet murmur of the train, the soft clicking of shoes against the floor, all felt so ordinary, so natural. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I gripped the pole tighter, my fingers now white-knuckled, my heart racing in a way that had nothing to do with the physical motion. I was aware of every movement, every shift, every breath I took, as though the train itself wasn't just stationary, it was frozen in time, while I was somehow moving on my own, drifting forward in the stillness. I glanced again out the window. The station platform outside was empty, just like it should have been at this hour. The faint glow of the overhead lights reflected off the tracks, stretching into the distance. But as I looked, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The platform was moving. The lights were blurring, their steady glow bleeding together into streaks, like the world was passing by me at an impossible speed, but the train remained still, stationary. I blinked rapidly, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The scene outside didn't match the feeling inside the train. Outside, everything was rushing past, but inside, I was stuck in place, frozen in time. I was aware of every detail, the softness of my coat, the coolness of the air conditioning, the faint rustling of newspapers being read. But the sensation of movement, of sliding forward, was undeniable. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to steady my mind, to convince myself it was just some odd, temporary illusion. But when I opened them again, nothing had changed. The world outside was still streaking past, faster now, almost too fast to comprehend. I could feel myself being pulled, pushed along in the same direction, but the train remained stationary, locked in its motionless state. The people around me hadn't noticed, hadn't moved an inch. I could hear the faintest hum now, a low sound that seemed to emanate from somewhere deep within the train, a sound I had never heard before. It was almost like the train was resonating with my thoughts, my confusion, amplifying my unease. The low whirring of the wheels on the tracks no longer felt comforting. It felt oppressive. It felt like it was holding me in place while the world around me twisted and blurred. Is this happening? I whispered to myself, the words barely audible over the strange humming. I looked down at my feet. They were moving, ever so slightly, as if walking, but my legs didn't feel like they were doing the work. I wasn't stepping forward. It was as if I was being carried along by some invisible force, as if the train's immobility had no effect on the direction I was heading. I began to panic, my breath quickening, my pulse racing. I wanted to stop, to scream, but the words stuck in my throat. I reached for the emergency button, but before I could press it, I noticed something else. The train's doors, once closed, once locked, were now wide open, the platforms outside rushing by faster than ever. I could hear the distant sound of people shouting, though no one had boarded. It was as if the train was leaving everything behind, taking me somewhere I didn't recognize, somewhere I didn't belong. The train stopped again. But I kept moving. This time, I could see it clearly. The platform was no longer there. The train was no longer in a station, it was somewhere else, somewhere I couldn't place. The world outside the windows was different. The lights were brighter, the air heavier. The people in the train were still oblivious, still untouched by the strange sensation I was feeling. But for me, the movement had become unbearable. I was moving through time, through space, but no longer with the train. I wasn't sure where I was heading, but I knew one thing for sure, I was no longer part of the world I had boarded in. And as the train finally began to slow, I was left to wonder if it would ever stop again, or if I would continue to move, forever, endlessly, without ever truly arriving. It was a foggy morning when I decided to take the long route, a walk through the park that led to the old stone bridge. I'd been meaning to do it for days, maybe weeks, but the usual distractions always got in the way, the rush of the workday, the errands, the noise of the world around me. Today, though, I had no plans other than to get lost in the quiet, in the solitude of the morning mist. The air was damp, the kind of damp that clung to your skin and made everything feel heavier, more enclosed. The park was eerily empty, the benches lined up like silent spectators, watching me as I walked along the winding path. The trees were shrouded in mist, their branches barely visible against the white-gray sky. It felt like the whole world was wrapped in a blanket of silence, as if the city, just beyond the park's edges, had disappeared. I came to the bridge just as I had hoped. It was old, weathered by time, its stone walls covered in ivy, with moss creeping up the edges like nature itself was trying to reclaim it. The bridge arched gracefully over a quiet stream, the water beneath dark and still, almost reflective, as though it was holding its breath. It was a peaceful place, a place that seemed untouched by the noise of the world. I paused at the start of the bridge, taking a deep breath, letting the cool, moist air fill my lungs. The silence felt like it was pressing in on me, but in a strange way, it was comforting. I could hear the faint rustle of leaves in the distance, the soft trickle of water beneath the bridge, but other than that, there was nothing. No voices, no footsteps, just the quiet hum of the world that seemed to exist only for me in that moment. I took my first step onto the bridge. The stones were cold beneath my feet, the texture rough and uneven. With each step, I felt the mist gather more closely around me, the air growing thicker as I moved forward. The bridge felt familiar, yet unfamiliar at the same time. I'd crossed it many times before, but today, there was something different about it. Something unsettling, though I couldn't quite place why. As I walked, the feeling of unease began to creep in. It wasn't a fear, not exactly, but a strange sensation that I wasn't truly alone on this bridge. I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see someone else, a passerby, a jogger, maybe a cyclist, but the path behind me was empty. The park was still as silent as it had been, and yet, something felt off. The mist seemed to be moving, swirling around me in patterns that didn't make sense. It wasn't the wind, I could tell that much. It felt as though the mist itself was reacting to my presence, like it was alive, following me with intent. I shook my head, dismissing the thought. It was just the fog playing tricks on my mind, nothing more. I pushed forward, determined to reach the other side. The bridge, though old, was sturdy. Each step seemed to sink into the stone, grounding me as I moved further. But the more I walked, the more I noticed how the mist thickened. It didn't just cover the bridge, it was swallowing it, creeping up the stone walls like a living thing. The stream below had become a mere whisper, the sound of water almost gone, replaced by an unsettling silence. The end of the bridge, the place where it should have led me out of the mist and into the open air, was still far off. But it didn't look quite right. The stone wall that should have marked the end of the bridge seemed distant, fading, like a memory slipping from my mind. I quickened my pace, hoping to reach it, to break through the fog, but no matter how much I hurried, the end of the bridge never seemed to get any closer. The stone walls were distant, as though they were always just beyond my reach. I stopped for a moment, staring ahead. The bridge stretched out before me, longer than it had ever been. The air was thick now, the mist curling around me, pressing in from all sides. It felt as though I was walking through a dream, but the kind of dream that feels real enough to make you question your every step. I looked down at the stones beneath my feet. The cracks in the stone seemed to shift, to change, as if the bridge itself was alive, reshaping itself with every step I took. I glanced back. The way I had come was gone. The park, the path, the familiar entrance to the bridge, they were all swallowed by the fog. There was no turning back. The bridge had become a loop, a pathway that stretched on forever, and no matter which direction I turned, the end was always just out of reach. I took another step forward, my heart pounding in my chest. The stone beneath my feet was colder now, as if the temperature had dropped suddenly, without warning. The mist had gathered even closer, wrapping around my legs, my arms, and soon, it felt like I was moving through a thick blanket of nothingness. I tried to move faster, to reach the end of the bridge, but with each step, the destination seemed to slip further away. The walls at the far end of the bridge were no longer visible. I stopped again, my breath shallow, panic beginning to creep in. The bridge was disappearing before my eyes. The stone walls, which had once seemed so solid, were now fading into the mist, like they were dissolving into the air. I could barely see the edge of the bridge anymore, and the stream beneath it was gone, replaced by an empty, fog-choked void. I reached out instinctively, my hand brushing the stone wall to my right, searching for something to hold on to, something that would ground me, but there was nothing. The stone felt cold and smooth, but now, as I touched it, it felt hollow, like the bridge itself was no longer real. And then, with a final, unsettling shift, the bridge vanished entirely. I stood there, in the middle of the mist, with no ground beneath my feet, no end in sight. The fog pressed in around me, thick and suffocating. There was nothing but silence, the kind of silence that feels too heavy, too complete. I was no longer on the bridge. I was nowhere. Just floating, suspended in the nothingness, with no way of knowing how I had gotten here or how to escape. And the more I tried to focus, to make sense of where I was, the more it felt as though the bridge had never existed at all. It was a typical Monday, or at least it should have been. The kind of morning when the sun hadn't quite reached its full strength, casting everything in a muted, grayish light. I woke up a bit later than usual, a reminder of the long weekend I'd just spent trying to catch up on sleep I had neglected throughout the week. The clock on my bedside table showed 8:15 when I first glanced at it, the numbers stark against the dark wood. My first instinct was to groan and reach for my phone, but before I could, I noticed something strange. The second hand was frozen. It wasn't stuck, exactly. It was as if it simply wasn't moving anymore. The little tick-tick-tick that usually filled the air with a quiet, almost imperceptible rhythm was gone. The second hand, once ticking forward, now remained still, poised halfway between two numbers. I frowned, thinking that maybe the battery was dying or something had gone wrong with the clock. I tried tapping the side of it, just to see if I could get it moving again, but there was no change. The clock was still frozen. The hour hand and minute hand, however, were moving, slowly but steadily, just like they should. I chalked it up to an odd glitch, a weird little anomaly, and decided it wasn't worth my time to worry about. I dragged myself out of bed, quickly getting dressed in the half-sleep haze that always seems to accompany my mornings. The room felt quiet, almost too quiet, as though the stillness of the clock had somehow spread to the air itself. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right, but I brushed it off as sleepiness lingering in my mind. As I went about my morning routine, making coffee, checking my messages, I couldn't help but glance at the clock now and then. The second hand was still stuck, unmoving. But the minute hand continued its slow, deliberate march forward. The hour hand too. The time was advancing, but the second hand never moved. I tried not to focus on it, but there was something oddly unsettling about it, something that began to gnaw at the edges of my thoughts. It felt as though I was in some strange loop, like the hands of time were refusing to follow their own rhythm, like the world was pushing forward while the clock was stubbornly resisting. I left for work soon after, but the clock's stillness lingered in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that something about time itself had been interrupted, disrupted, as if a small part of reality had gone awry. I tried to distract myself with the usual morning chaos, the noise of the street, the traffic, the usual rush of the day, but it was all there, underneath it all, that strange feeling of something off, something not quite right. The day passed as usual, but as I sat down for lunch, I caught myself glancing at my wristwatch. The same thing. The second hand wasn't moving. I tilted my wrist, watching it carefully, hoping it was just a temporary lapse. But no, the hands were stuck. I couldn't stop looking at it. The hours passed by, and every time I glanced at the clock, it felt like time was moving faster around me while the hands stayed still. It was the strangest sensation, this eerie feeling that time itself was flowing, but the clock was somehow frozen in place. I could see the minutes ticking by, people going about their business, the sun shifting across the sky as the day wore on. But I wasn't sure what to make of the fact that the hands on the clock simply refused to follow the natural course of things. That night, I sat down at my desk, still thinking about the clock. I couldn't help but fixate on it. It had become an obsession in a way. The more I tried to ignore it, the more impossible it became to do so. My eyes kept darting back to the stillness of the second hand, and the longer I stared at it, the more everything else around me seemed to fall away. It was as if the world had continued on, sweeping me forward with it, while the clock refused to let go of the moment I had first noticed it. Everything had become a blur, like I was floating outside of time itself. I had no way of knowing if the day had passed quickly or slowly, if the hours were truly slipping by or if I was stuck in some kind of suspended moment. I tried to sleep that night, but sleep felt like a foreign concept. The stillness of the clock haunted me in my dreams, its hands stuck, unwilling to move, while the rest of the world moved on. I woke up several times, disoriented, unsure if I had even slept at all. Each time, I would glance at the clock, and still, the second hand wouldn't budge. It was as though the world had decided to keep going without me, leaving me behind in this strange, frozen moment. The next morning, I woke to the sound of my alarm, and for a brief, fleeting moment, I thought maybe everything had gone back to normal. But when I looked at the clock, I saw that the second hand was still stuck. It had been over 24 hours now, and it still hadn't moved. The hands continued to move, though. The hour hand and minute hand were steady, ticking away as though everything were fine. But the second hand remained, frozen. It felt like time itself was slipping through my fingers, like I was watching the world continue without me. I could see people moving, the world turning, but it was as if I was being left behind, locked in this frozen moment, unable to catch up. It was an unsettling feeling, one I couldn't shake no matter how hard I tried. I could see the hands moving, slowly pushing forward, but it felt like I wasn't really there. The second hand was still, and that stillness had started to feel like a reflection of something deeper, something about time that I couldn't quite understand. The more I looked at it, the more I felt like I was slipping away, caught in this endless loop of progress without progress. I don't know how long I stared at it that day, hours, maybe longer, but by the time the evening arrived, something had changed. I wasn't sure when it happened, but as I glanced at the clock once more, I realized something. The hands had finally aligned. The hour hand, the minute hand, and, finally, the second hand had all moved to the same point. But everything had stopped. It wasn't the world that had stopped. I could hear the sounds of the city, the people moving outside, the hum of the streetlights. It wasn't the clock that had stopped, either. Its hands were finally aligned, but it was me. I had stopped. I was no longer moving forward. The clock had moved on, but I hadn't. And now, as I look at it, I'm not sure I ever will again. It was one of those quiet mornings when everything seemed to slow down, as if the world itself was taking a deep breath before the day began. I woke up early, as I often did, and went through the usual motions, stretching, reaching for my phone, checking the time. It was only 7:15 a.m., still early enough that the city hadn't fully woken up yet. The faint light of dawn filtered through my blinds, and I was grateful for the silence. It felt like the calm before the storm of a busy day ahead. I pulled myself out of bed and walked over to the window, wanting to get a glimpse of the world outside, as I always did. It was a habit I never seemed to grow out of, this need to check the sky first thing in the morning. As I pulled the blinds up, I noticed something strange. The sky was unchanged. The exact same sky as yesterday. It wasn't exactly startling, but it felt odd, unsettling in a way I couldn't quite place. I stared at it for a moment, the familiar shade of gray-blue stretched out in front of me, clouds slowly drifting by, their shapes lazy and soft, the sun still hidden behind the horizon. It was exactly as it had been the day before. I frowned. I must have been imagining things, I thought. The sky was always a little different from one day to the next, right? Clouds moved, the colors shifted depending on the time of day. But this felt too familiar. Too much like yesterday, as though the world hadn't changed at all. I shook my head, trying to brush off the feeling. I'd had strange dreams the night before, dreams where time seemed to loop, repeating the same moments over and over. Maybe that was all this was, just a remnant of those dreams bleeding into my waking hours. But even so, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I turned away from the window and went about my morning routine, but my mind kept drifting back to that sky. It felt as though I had already seen it. It was as if I had stepped into the same moment I had experienced yesterday, like the day was repeating itself in some quiet, unnoticed way. But no, that couldn't be right. It was a new day. It had to be. My phone told me so. The date was different. My calendar had moved on. Still, when I glanced back out the window, the sky was exactly the same. I hadn't been imagining it. It was there, the same thick layer of clouds, the same muted light, the same quiet stretch of blue. It was like I had looked out the window yesterday morning and then again today, but nothing had changed. Time had moved forward in every other way, but the sky had stayed the same, frozen, repeating itself in a way that felt impossible. I couldn't help myself. I grabbed my jacket and headed out, the same unease gnawing at me, refusing to be ignored. I needed to see the world beyond my window. Maybe if I stepped outside, I'd break this feeling that everything was wrong, that I was stuck in some loop I couldn't escape. The city was waking up slowly. People were already walking down the streets, some hurrying to work, others taking their time. The hum of traffic filled the air, a familiar noise, one I had heard countless times. But the deeper I walked into the street, the more I felt the same strange weight on my chest. The same weight I had felt when I first saw the sky this morning. I couldn't explain it, but everything seemed so static. The world around me was moving, but the feeling of stillness pressed in on me, as if time was moving forward in some places, but standing still in others. It was as though the city had changed, but the sky, the sky, had stayed the same, repeating itself, frozen in some quiet moment, like a memory that refused to fade. I found myself standing still in the middle of the sidewalk, watching the sky above. I stared at the clouds drifting, slowly, as they had been before, just like yesterday. They weren't different. They weren't moving faster or slower than they should have. It was as though the exact moment I had seen the sky yesterday was playing out again before me, and I wasn't sure if I had missed the shift, if I was somehow stuck in yesterday without even realizing it. I reached up to touch my face, as if to make sure I wasn't dreaming, but the coolness of the air felt too real, too solid to be just a figment of my imagination. I took a deep breath, and the smell of the city, the faint scent of morning dew, was familiar, comforting, even, but it did nothing to ease the unsettling feeling growing in the pit of my stomach. I walked, then, a few more steps, trying to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just a trick of the mind. But no matter where I went, no matter how much I tried to move forward, the sky above me stayed the same. The same low-hanging clouds, the same dull shade of blue. I crossed streets, I walked through alleys, I even found myself at a small park where I often took a shortcut, but still, the sky was the same. It had to be. There was no way around it. It was as though the world around me was continuing on, but the sky, the one thing I had no control over, was frozen, like the backdrop of some unfinished play, suspended in time. I felt like I was walking through a dream, unable to wake up, trapped in a moment that kept repeating itself, no matter how much I tried to move forward. I don't know when it happened, but the feeling eventually wore off, slowly, like a fog lifting. Maybe I had walked far enough to leave the strange sensation behind. By the time I returned to my apartment, I could no longer sense the weight in the air, but the unease lingered in the back of my mind. Later, as I stood at my window again, the sky had changed. The clouds had shifted, the color deepened, and the sunlight pierced through the gray, casting sharp shadows across the buildings below. But in my mind, the old sky, the one from yesterday, lingered, unshakable. I don't know why it felt so significant. But something about that sky, the way it had been the same, haunts me. The same clouds. The same light. The same moment repeating itself in my memory. And now, no matter how much time passes, no matter how many days go by, I still look up and wonder if, somewhere out there, the sky is still waiting for me to catch up.